Hello again. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Robert and Clara Schumann. And I'm starting from page 229 in the 9th brief edition of the Canian text. And they start off by saying, Robert Schumann, born 1810, which by the way is right around the same time as Felix Mendelssohn, who was born 1809. Schumann was born 1810, and then our last two composers that we'll talk about in the next lecture, last two for this unit, are Chopin and Liszt. Chopin was born 1810, same year as Schumann, and Liszt was born 1811. So a whole generation of great composers born right around the same time. It says, Robert Schumann, in many ways, embodied musical romanticism. His works are intensely autobiographical. So remember, this is, again, something to remember about the romantic approach in any of the arts. It's very sort of personal, very often autobiographical, in a way that classical art or music isn't necessarily. So, for example, Mozart's music doesn't necessarily reflect the struggles that were going on in his own life. Not always, anyway, because I don't think Mozart really saw that as his job, to looking at music as sort of like a diary where you pour out your own individual personal feelings. Yes, there are feelings, there are emotions that are expressed, but they aren't necessarily your own. Again, I think today we still have a very romantic idea of what the purpose of art is, which is to express yourself, to express your inner feelings. And that's not necessarily the same conception of the purpose of art that artists or musicians or poets or whatever of previous generations had. That's a romantic notion that we've kind of inherited that comes out of this era. Anyway, Schumann's works are intensely autobiographical and usually have descriptive titles, texts, or programs. So this is another thing to remember about the Romantic era. It is the era of program music and of music that very often has a descriptive title. Again, in the classical period, we don't see nearly as many descriptive titles of pieces. Something like symphony or string quartet or concerto isn't really a descriptive title. It tells you what type of piece it is, but it doesn't describe what's going on or give you a clue as to what the story is or how you should feel, right? So those kinds of pieces, symphonies, concertos, string quartets, are generally what we think of as absolute music. And the opposite, of course, is program music. It says here, he expressed his essentially lyrical nature in startlingly original piano pieces and songs. Schumann is best known probably for his piano pieces, most of which are what we would call character pieces. That is, brief, single movement works, maybe, typically 3 or 4 minutes long, that have a descriptive title, which again is unlike the typical classical era piano piece, which is a sonata, right? Which is a multi-movement work which doesn't have a descriptive title. Schumann did compose a few sonatas as well, but he composed far more of these little character pieces, and he sometimes kind of grouped them together into what we might call suites. That is a large multi-movement work that is made up of, let's say, a dozen or so character pieces. And he is also, as the book notes, a great song composer. I would say that I think most people agree that Schumann is the second greatest composer of art songs. Schubert is definitely number 1, and Schumann is number 2, the two Schu composers. Schumann composed all types of music, though. He did compose symphonies, composed 4 symphonies, composed a lot of chamber music for small ensemble, instrumental music for small ensemble, composed oratorios, composed an opera, but he is best known for his piano pieces and his songs. As a gifted writer and critic, he also discovered and made famous some of the leading composers of his day. So this is an interesting aspect of Schumann, which kind of comes out of his biography. Like the other composers that I've talked about so far, Berlioz and Schubert, Berlioz, Mendelssohn, Schumann also was not born into a particularly musical family. That is, his father was not a musician. His father was a bookseller. So Schumann grew up around books and had a love of literature and also became something of a writer himself, a writer on music. He was one of the leading music critics of his day and actually founded his own music magazine, sort of like the Rolling Stone of classical music in the 19th century. And one of Schumann's talents actually was noticing and discovering new talent and recognizing the greatness of other composers. So this was certainly the case with, for example, Chopin, who, remember, was born the same year as Schumann. And we'll talk about Chopin in the next lecture. But Schumann wrote in the first issue, I believe, of this music magazine, wrote a glowing review of Chopin's piano music and immediately recognized him as a genius. Later, toward the end of Schumann's life, and I believe in the last issue of this magazine, to which Schumann contributed, he wrote about Johannes Brahms. So Brahms, who we unfortunately won't have time to get to in this unit, Brahms is of a younger generation. He was born in 1833. And was kind of like just a struggling pianist, composer, not at all famous. When he was about 20 years old, he just kind of knocked on Schumann's door and introduced himself. And Schumann invited him in, and said, "Oh, so you're a composer? Why don't you play some of your music for me?" So Brahms sat down and started to play, and Schumann was just blown away. And he called his wife Clara and said, "Clara, come here, this young man play." And Schumann was just blown away and immediately wrote this review of this previously unknown composer, Johannes Brahms, and just was over the top in his praise. In fact, to a degree that Brahms was a little bit nervous because he thought, "Well, my God, how am I going to live up to this?" But it was really Schumann who discovered Brahms, and I guess Brahms probably would have been discovered by somebody in any event. As I stated before, my humble opinion, Brahms is the greatest composer of the 19th century. But let's get back to Schumann for a moment. And by the way, after Schumann died, Brahms maintained a friendship with Clara Schumann right until the end of both of their lives. Clara died in 1896, Brahms died in 1897, and they were very, very close. Brahms was kind of like a member of the Schumann family. And when Schumann, for example, was hospitalized because he was a schizophrenic, sadly, it was often Brahms who sort of moved in and looked after the children because Clara was oft on tour performing. As we'll see, Clara Schumann was one of the leading pianists of the 19th century, and she was really more the breadwinner in the family. So when Robert took ill, it was Brahms who moved in, looked after the children so that Clara could go out and play and earn money. Anyway, I know I'm just kind of coming at this from all angles here. Let's talk a little bit about Schumann's life story. So, as I said, his father was a bookseller, and it was thought that young Robert Schumann, should go into some respectable career, like maybe become a lawyer. So he went to college, studied law, was never interested in law. And supposedly he skipped his classes quite a bit and instead loved music. And when he was something like 18 or 19 years old, he decided to write a letter to his mother from college saying, "Look, Mom, I don't want to be a lawyer. I don't want to study law. I want to be a musician. I want to be a pianist." And his mother was just horrified, of course, said, "Oh, what would your father say?" And but eventually, and it's kind of unusual, eventually she relented and allowed him to pursue his dream. And so, and it's very unusual, by the way, to decide at age 19 or 20 that you want to become a professional pianist. That kind of thing, it's sort of like deciding you want to be an Olympic figure skater at age 20. You have to start very, very young and have a lot of intense training and years of practice. Starting at 18 or 19 is a very dicey kind of proposition. So it was decided that, well, what we need to do is find the best teacher we possibly can. And so they went to this guy named Friedrich Wieck, spelled W-I-E-C-K. And Friedrich Wieck had a reputation as a great piano teacher, mostly because his daughter, young Clara Wieck, was a piano prodigy, was a very accomplished pianist, even when she was just, 8 or 9 years old. So that was kind of the basis for Friedrich's reputation. So Robert started studying with Friedrich Wieck, and as the years went on, he made progress, and Wieck assured Schumann's mother that one day he would be one of the greatest pianists in the world. But unfortunately, Robert was a little bit too eager, in a sense, because as all pianists discover, when you start to play and you get into sort of advanced pieces, your fourth finger just doesn't seem as nimble somehow as your other fingers. And this is just a physiological fact, and it has to do with the fact that your fourth finger is the only finger which doesn't have its own tendon. It shares a short little tendon with both your fifth finger and with your third finger. And this is why the fourth finger just doesn't work as well independently of the other fingers. Well, Schumann saw this as a problem to be solved somehow, and he invented a little contraption, sort of like an exercise machine, for his finger. And he referred to it as the cigar box device. I believe he made it out of a cigar box with weights on the lid and sort of a pulley system, so that he could sit there and eat his lunch or read a book and do these little workouts with his fourth finger over and over again, trying to strengthen it. Unfortunately, this had the opposite of the intended effect, and he ruined his fourth finger, and also ruined any chance that he could have at a career as a performing pianist. But this did not, this didn't trouble him too much, because by this time he had been secretly dating Clara, secretly, because Friedrich Wieck did not want to waste his daughter's talent and her brilliant future on this rather eccentric young man, his student, who had just ruined his finger. Friedrich Wieck was very much against their seeing each other, and so they had to date in secret. But this injury of Robert Schumann's didn't bother him so much, because, first of all, he became more interested in composing rather than performing, and also the fact that he was eventually secretly engaged to one of the greatest pianists in the world. So he didn't really need to perform for himself. He could be the composer, and Clara could be the performer. So they had this kind of partnership going. Now, Clara, as we will see, was also a gifted composer. But once she married Robert Schumann, when she was legally able to do so without her father's consent, I believe the day after her 18th birthday, she married Robert. And after she married Robert Schumann, she didn't do nearly as much composing as she had done before, and instead focused on performing particularly her husband's works, but also works by Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, other composers. So As I mentioned, sadly, Robert Schumann was a schizophrenic. And schizophrenia, by the way, is not the same thing as multiple personality disorder, although Schumann also had sort of multiple personalities in a way. He had multiple musical personalities. I'll talk about that in a second. Schizophrenics are people who hear voices in their head, who sometimes believe that other people can read their thoughts, or that they can read other people's thoughts, or that other people's thoughts are being broadcast into their minds somehow, and that's why where the voices come from. In Schumann's case, he believed that either devils or angels were kind of speaking to him, or sometimes singing to him. And sometimes he would hear what he thought were the voices of angels, and he would even try to write down the music that they were singing to him. And then the angels would turn to devils, and he was unfortunately very, very troubled. I think there's some speculation today that this, in fact, it's probably more than just speculation, that the schizophrenia may have been brought on by the treatment that he was taking for syphilis. It was a very common ailment in those days. As you recall, Schubert died of syphilis. One of the treatments for syphilis in those days involved the use of heavy metals like mercury or lead. And I think sometimes it was like it was an ointment that you used, or somehow, of course, doctors back then really didn't know what they were doing for the most part, and the treatment was almost as bad as the disease. So this is probably what caused his mental deterioration. Although it might have just been inherited from birth. In fact, at least one of Robert and Clara's 6 children, I believe they had 6 children, maybe it was more like 8 or 9 children. They had a lot of kids, and at least 1 or 2 of them were mentally ill and troubled as well. In, I believe it was 1853, this illness progressed to a point where Schumann had to be put in an institution, where he actually sometimes showed signs of recovery and then lapsed into further illness. In fact, the incident which caused him to finally be institutionalized was he attempted suicide. He he did jump into the freezing Rhine River. The Schumanns at that time lived near a bridge over the Rhine, and Schumann one day, just in his nightgown, walked out over the bridge and jumped into the river, was fished out by some fishermen who happened to be in a boat nearby, and was thereafter institutionalized. So, as I've already said, Schumann's best-known pieces are his piano pieces and his songs. Schumann had a kind of a unique approach to, at least as far as I know, a unique approach to composition. He would work on one type of piece for a long time and then switch to something else. So, for example, the book mentions during the first 10 years of his creative life, Schumann published only piano pieces. And then when he was married in 1840, he started composing more songs. And then after a while, he switched to composing chamber music and symphonies. And he eventually got around to all of it, really. And the example that the book uses as a sample of Schumann's music is a collection of character pieces, a sort of a suite, which he called Fantasiestücke, fantasy pieces. And each one of them has a different descriptive title. The 2 that are given as examples, one of them is called Soaring, Aufschwung in German, and the other one is simply called Why, Warum. And they have very different moods. The soaring is very impassioned and often agitated, often loud. And the Warum, or why, is very introverted, very soft and gentle. And these reflect two kind of aspects of Schumann's personality, which Schumann kind of had this kind of cast of characters in his mind, of different distinct aspects of his own personality that he kind of turned into sort of fictional characters. And this is kind of unusual. So he even sort of credited these different characters, Florestan and Eusebius, and there were other characters in this sort of menagerie in his mind. He actually credited them with the composition, in a sense. This is the way he did his criticism as well. That is the articles that he wrote for magazines, newspapers, for his own magazine, for example. They were often in the form of sort of like a panel discussion among these different characters. Florestan, Eusebius, Raro, who was sort of like a master kind of figure, like an elderly master teacher type. These are distinct sides of his own personality that, again, are sort of personified into these sort of these personalities. In fact, a lot of Schumann's piano music, in particular, are sort of like little portraits of people. For example, there's another set of character pieces called Carnival, and the idea is that Schumann is sort of imagining himself at a masked ball, which is common during Carnival season. That is the lead up to Lent, and these masked balls were very popular in Europe, and so he imagines himself at a masked ball, and he sees various people, some of them real, like Chopin, for example, makes an appearance, and the great violinist Paganini, and Clara herself makes an appearance. And then some of these fictional characters as well make appearances. And, of course, they are all wearing masks. So there's sort of like the real character, and then there's the character that they are pretending to be behind the mask. And it's all done, again, not with words. There are no words. It's just solo piano pieces. But each one kind of distills the essence of these different personalities. And one in particular, which, again, is not in your listening, is his portrait of Chopin. So Schumann wrote a little piece called Chopin, and it's a brilliant musical portrait of Chopin. It sounds so much like Chopin. If you heard it, you would think that it actually is by Chopin, but it's Schumann imitating Chopin. And sadly, Chopin was actually kind of offended by this. He didn't sort of take it in the right spirit as sort of a tribute. Instead, he thought he was being sort of made fun of. And I guess from that point on, Schumann and Chopin didn't really get along because Chopin had been offended. But Schumann knew all of these other composers that I've talked about. For example, he was a very close friend of Felix Mendelssohn. He actually named one of his own children Felix after Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn actually hired Schumann to be the orchestra conductor at the Leipzig Conservatory. So remember, Mendelssohn founded this music school, the Leipzig Conservatory, hired Schumann to be the director of the orchestra, the student orchestra. That didn't last very long. Schumann was not a conductor, really. And again, he had a very eccentric personality even before his mental illness really took over. Now, I've already talked about Clara a little bit in talking about Robert. She was a child prodigy and one of the leading pianists of the 19th century. And this is at a time, of course, when women were kind of discouraged from being professional anything, and that includes musicians. Now, women were expected to be, that is, let's say, middle class and higher women, were expected to be proficient amateur musicians, and sometimes they were just as good as any of the male professional musicians. But, the society being the way it was at the time, it was kind of unusual for a woman, except in the case of singers, obviously, for a woman to make a career as a performer. In fact, of course, the orchestras at the time, women were not allowed. I believe that the Berlin Philharmonic had a strict male-only policy all the way up until something like 1993, I believe. Women were not allowed to be in the Berlin Philharmonic. So female composers like Clara Schumann, and also, for example, Mendelssohn's sister, Fanny Mendelssohn, often had to resort to publishing their works under a male pseudonym. In the case of Fanny Mendelssohn, she sometimes had her works published under her brother's name because the publisher would accept the works of Felix Mendelssohn, but from a woman, they might not. And this is also, of course, true of women authors at the time, right? In fact, as we will see, one of Chopin's, they never married, but Chopin's significant other was just such a person, George Sand. If you've heard of the author George Sand, not her real name was Aurore Dudevant, but George Sand was Chopin's girlfriend for something like a dozen years or so, and she wrote under that pseudonym. Franz Liszt, also one of his significant love interests, the mother of his three children, whom, again, he never married, but the Countess Marie d'Agoult wrote under the pen name Daniel Stern. Anyway, Clara Schumann, again, one of the great pianists of the day, married Robert Schumann when, the day before her 21st birthday. I think I said her 18th birthday. But it was the day before her 21st birthday because on her 21st birthday, and I guess she jumped the gun, she was a day early, she would be legally allowed to marry without her father's consent. Her father being very much opposed, of course. By all accounts, they were pretty happily married. They had 7 children, and one died in infancy. So when I said 6, I guess I was more or less correct. Again, after Robert Schumann's death, Clara Schumann remained very, very close to Johannes Brahms. There's a lot of speculation that Brahms may have actually been in love with her, but in any case, they were very, very deeply attached to each other. And in fact, Brahms would often, before he published one of his own compositions, he would send it off to Clara for her opinion of it, and for her to get a preview of it, so that you can see how highly he valued her judgment and taste. And she, like her husband, composed all kinds of pieces, but of course, being a pianist, she's best known for her piano music and her songs. And in the textbook, we have an example of one of the lieder or art songs by Clara Schumann. And looking at the text of this song, again, we can hopefully, as you read it, some little lights will go off in your head that are corresponding to things that we've already learned about Romanticism, especially all this nature imagery, right? The Romantics loved nature. And so the words here, he has come in storm and rain. My anxious heart beats to meet his own. How could I suspect that his paths would unite with mine? So this image of storm and rain. He has come in storm and rain. With daring, he has taken my heart. Did he take mine? Did I take his? The two hearts drew nearer to each other. And then the final verses, he has come in storm and rain. Now spring's blessings have come. My friend goes forth. I do not grieve, for he remains mine with every step I take. So there's definitely, I think, this text, and I'm not sure who wrote, Ruckert. wrote the text, but it could be about Clara and Robert's own life, right? You can imagine him sneaking away and meeting with Clara and then having to leave again, right? My friend goes forth. I do not grieve, for he remains mine with every step I take. So it's definitely sort of autobiographical. Again, the Romantics wanted to express their own innermost feelings and experiences, and often used nature imagery as sort of as the book says, a mirror for the human heart. The emotions are somehow reflected in nature. Okay, so listen to the examples in the saved playlist for the Romantic era. And our next and final lecture for this semester will be on the two greatest pianist composers of the 19th century, Frédéric Chopin and Franz Liszt. See you then.